What's up guys, I'm Rich from Spray Black Studios and today I'm going to teach you how I painted this Flesh Tearer Bladeguard Veteran. So then guys, with the pre-orders coming up of the new Space Marines Codex this weekend, I figured it's a pretty good opportunity for me to add to my Blood Angels Successors Force, the Angels Luciferous. This is a custom chapter I've made based on the Flesh Tearer's colour scheme, but with it being predominantly Primaris or Primaris scaled, it figured didn't really sit right to have them as Flesh Tearers with the whole distrust of the new Primaris. I'll also admit, for me, the Flesh Tearer's colour scheme as painted by the heavy metal artists in the Codex doesn't really gel with what I see them to be. It's very clean and very crisp, whether the Flesh Tearers are psychopaths. They should be dark and gritty. So I've developed this colour scheme with a little bit of help from my brain trust, and it's one that I feel definitely feels a little bit more like it should. Now this video is going to show my process in painting a single model, so it may jump around a little bit. I'm definitely not doing an exercise in batch painting here. So then if you want to learn how to paint a Flesh Tearer with a paint scheme that's going to properly encapsulate their darker side, keep watching. Here we go. So having built this model in sub-assemblies and primed using Games Workshop's Chaos Black spray, we're going to start off by laying down the base coat. For this I'm using a mixture of Vallejo's Scarlet Red and Vallejo Black through an airbrush, but a couple of thin coats of Games Workshop's Gal Vorbak will do just as well. Having laid down the base coat, I'm now going to do a heavy wash with Drakenhof Nightshade. This will add in a nice blue tone to the shadows and will darken that base tone down nicely. Now it's looking a bit flat, so we're going to need to bring it back up a bit. So for this we're going to apply a heavy dry brush with Gal Vorbak. For the next couple of steps we're going to be using almost exclusively zenithal highlighting. When dry brushing, if you ensure that you are painting from the top of the model down and then only applying paint on the downstrokes, it will pick out all of those raised areas and leave the nice blue tinted shadows as they are. For the second step of this we'll go to Corn Red and apply a much lighter dry brushing in the same fashion. Be sure to pick out the higher areas and those areas which would most likely catch the light. So that's the red done, and let's face it, that was pretty easy. Now we're going to start to block in a few of the other areas. For the ribbon between the armour plates we're going to start off with Corvus Black. I'm also going to use the Corvus Black for the material on his robes. With the feel that we want for this model, I don't really want the robes standing out too much, being too bright, and specifically don't want them being overpowering. Remember to use a few thin coats here, as areas like this it can be super noticeable if you build up too much paint too quickly and leave too much texture. For the shoulder pads, the tilt plate and the detail on his chest, we're going to base with Abaddon Black. Thinning your paint is pretty essential here. Abaddon Black has great coverage, but we want these shoulder pads looking lovely and smooth. For the highlighting on these areas, we're going to use my favourite black workup. Initially starting with a full edge highlight using Dark Reaper. This method gives a nice little blue tint to the highlights, and this ties in beautifully with the blue shadows of those red areas. Almost like I'd planned it. For the top highlight in this method, we'll turn to Thunderhawk Blue. Just apply this to the top of the raised areas and the corners of the shoulder pad and the details on his chest. So once those black areas are done, I'm going to pop back down to the ribbon between the armour paints and the cloak. Now in the Games Workshop range, the natural workup from Corvus Black is through Eshin Grey and Dawnstone. So that's exactly what we're going to do. With the paint thinned to a nice consistency and a nicely pointed brush, we're going to apply the highlights to all those raised areas of the ribbon, and we're going to start the process of layering up the highlights on those robes. Now, rather than wet blending or glazing up the highlights on these robes, we're going to go the slightly simpler route and just do a little bit of layering. Laying down multiple semi-opaque layers of this paint will give a slight blend and give a bit more of a natural transition. For the gold areas, we're going to use the same method that I used for my sanguinary guard and that I used on the vampire tutorial a couple of videos back. Starting off with the base of warp block bronze and then going to a layer of Sycorax bronze. We'll then finish it off with a coat of Reikland flesh shade to give a little warmth back to it and to pick out those shadows. For the leather areas of his holster and pouches, we're going to use 2 thin coats of Rhinox hide as our base. And whilst these are drying, we'll pick out the pistol and the cap of the holster with a Baden black. I'm then going to proceed to use the same workup of Dark Reaper of Thunderhawk blue that we did on the shoulder pads and the tilt plate. To highlight the leather, I'll then make up a roughly 50-50 mix of Rhinox hide and Steel Legion drab and pick out those edges. I'll also use this to throw a few little scratches and marks onto the leather just to give it that impression of being a bit more worn. Finishing the highlights off with pure Steel Legion drab on the very corners and edges of the leather just to make it look nice and tatty. We'll also need a little wash of Drakenhof Nightshade again to pick out those shadows and to tie it all in with our armour. For the purity seals, I use a fairly simple build starting with base coat of Rakarth flesh. With some thinned Corvus black, a very fine point on my brush and a steady hand, I'll then add in some wavy lines to replicate some writing on these seals. With a little bit of corn red added for colour, and then to do the wax seals, we'll then finish this off with a nice wash of Agrax Earthshade to give it that old and worn look. So now that's the body of the Marine all complete, we'll head over to his power sword. Using the same techniques that we've already used to paint up the handle in black and the hilt in gold, we'll pop it on fast forward for this bit. For the blade itself, we're going to have a bit of fun with the airbrush a little later on. But to get it ready, a couple of thin coats of Vallejo's Storm Blue will be laid down and left to dry. Now the standout parts of these models is this absolutely glorious storm shield. We aren't going to do anything crazy with this though, and keeping to the same colour palette as the rest of the model, we'll lay down an Abaddon black base coat into the inside of the shield. Now using that same gold workup that we've used earlier, we'll paint the rim of the shield and that awesome detailing in the middle with warp block bronze. Adding in the Sycorax bronze again will brighten it all up, and then a wash of Reikland flesh shade will be added to pick out that lovely detail and dull it down just a touch to match with the rest of the gold areas on the Mini. Now out comes the Dark Reaper and Thunderhawk Blue again to add the edge highlighting, and that'll be the shield all done. Now I promised some airbrush fun for the blade, and here we go. Using Vallejo's French Blue, I'll build up a couple of brighter spots on each side of the blade, being careful to try and layer this to provide a nice blend from the brightest spot in the middle to the Storm Blue base. We're going to gradually build this up. Next, with a mix of Storm Blue and Ice Blue, we'll be even more careful to pick out the middle of this gradient, and then moving on to pure ice blue, we'll add the brightest spot right in the middle. If done right, you can get a beautiful blend here. Now whilst the blade looks fairly cool as it is, we need to add a little edge highlight into it to really make it pop. Grabbing out the ice blue, and with a steady hand and pointy brush, we'll add an edge highlight to the ridge down the middle of the blade and to the very edges. Throw in a little white into the ice blue will then give us our top highlight, which is reserved just for the edges where the bright spots are and the very tip of the blade. Now I'm sure there are some out there who have been wondering where his head is. Well, for models like this, I'll almost always paint the head in a sub-assembly. I'm using a reefer head for this model, as it's pretty intimidating and definitely more fitting for a Flesh Tearer. For the helmeted area of the head, we'll use the Abaddon Black, Dark Reaper and Thunderhawk Blue again, in exactly the same way as the shoulder pads and the tilt plate. For the flesh itself, we'll start with a nice smooth coat of Bugman's Glow, and then build up the layers through a 50-50 mix of Bugman's Glow and Kislev flesh, up to a pure Kislev flesh. It's super important to thin your paints again at this point, as you really want to get this finish as smooth as possible. We're going to paint some fairly simple eyes on this guy, so after painting the eye sockets in black, we'll carefully add some Ulthuan Grey for the whites of his eyes, and then a small black dot in the middle for the iris. The final part of the head to be done is the faceplate, and for this we'll go for an aged bone look. A base coat of Rakarth flesh and a thin coat of Agrax Earthshade will give us a nice, easy but pretty effective look. Once the Agrax Earthshade's dried, you can pop back in with Rakarth flesh just to pick out the highlights, just to make sure it's not too dull. Now to put these sub-assemblies together, we use a little bit of super glue, and then for the base, in true Blue Peter fashion, we'll attach him to this rocky urban base that I made earlier. So here he is, ready to rip and tear. Whilst I'll say this is definitely a bit of a quicker paint job and I've definitely cut a few corners here and there, it is one that is quite effective and they do look great on the tabletop. Now if you've seen my previous Custodes video, I'm sure you're aware that I don't really like to stick to prescribed colour schemes. I like to experiment and find my own ways of twisting colour schemes to really get the feel that I want. With an army like the Flesh Tearers, the heavy metal paint job just really doesn't fit what I want out of them, or it doesn't feel like a Flesh Tearer should. They're described in the lore as borderline psychopaths that are just ready to get in and rip and tear, so I can't really see them wearing pristine, bright, shining armour. Unlike some armies, say like the Ultramarines maybe, they like to get stuck into the thick of things. And certainly, there is no time for polishing when you're ready to rip and tear. Now, as much as I want to admit that I'm not the biggest fan of Space Marines, I will say that some of these Indomitus models are stunning. I've really enjoyed painting this Bladeguard Veteran, and I do have a handful of others waiting to be painted. I think, unfortunately, there may be some more Space Marines in my near future. So thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like and feel free to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on my upcoming releases. If you want to support the channel, then all I can really ask is that you share this video with maybe a couple of friends who you feel will be interested or could take a bit of value out of it. I can also be found on various social media platforms such as Instagram and now Facebook, so please feel free to come find me, give the page a like and just let me know what you think. Whether there's videos that you want to see me try and attempt or anything that you think I may be able to give a shot, just let me know. We'll see what we can do. And remember guys, if all else fails, spray it black and start again.